The one time I do relax at a desk is when I'm playing Dwarf Fortress.
Yeah. I mean,
That's a lie. That's a segue.
Is it awakening?
I'm not on a segue here. I haven't fallen over yet.
My segue, I was going to throw in a segue of speaking of games that constantly update new versions and sequels and reiterate themselves. You know?
Dwarf Fortress?
Yeah.
Well, Dwarf Fortress is a sequel.
Sequel to what?
Sequel.
Slaves to Armok.
Yeah,
Dwarf Fortress is Slaves to Armok, God of Blood, Chapter 2, Dwarf Fortress.
Yeah, you didn't know it was Chapter 2? Come on. What? You ever heard of
Histories
the game
of
before?
randomly generated word and randomly generated word.
I'm pretty sure the only way to figure that out is to actually load up the title screen of Dwarf Fortress. I don't think it's marketed anywhere as Chapter 2 of anything.
The full title for Dwarf Fortress is as follows, and I just loaded up the game to check. Slaves to Armok, God of Blood, Chapter 2, Dwarf Fortress, Histories of Cupidity and Toil is what I got.
Does he update that every major update? Does he add something there?
The histories of da-da-da and da-da-da? No. It just pulls two random words out of the game's dictionary. I just relaunched the game. Slaves to Armok, God of Blood, Chapter 2, Dwarf Fortress, Histories of Curiosity and Determination.
Ooh.
Yeah, that's a good one. Let's see what else I got. Dwarf Fortress, okay, Slaves to Armok, God of Blood, Chapter 2, Dwarf Fortress, Histories of Determination and Destruction.
Sounds about right. And every fortress is actually a sequel to the last fortress. So it's full of sequels, really, if you think about it.
Yeah, Dwarf Fortress is, Arch, I don't know if you've seen this before, but just go to Google Images and type in Slaves to Armok, A-M-R-O-K. Because Slaves to Armok, God of Blood was the game that Zach and Tarn worked on before they worked on Dwarf Fortress. And the end goal for it was to basically be what Dwarf Fortress is now, this endless forever game that randomly generates itself that's endlessly replayable, but it was fully 3D. And
it seems to have graphics?
Yep. And now it might make more sense why Dwarf Fortress hasn't had graphics for so long.
Yeah, Dwarf Fortress is actually a compromise. Dwarf Fortress was a game made because the original idea was just too big for the team, like two people, almost just one person. I'm pretty sure Tarn does the majority of the work, especially since it's such a code-heavy game. But anyway, yeah, Dwarf Fortress is a compromise.
Yeah, I'm seeing some
Dwarf
of those.
Fortress was a 3-month side project to distract themselves from the game that they knew they would never finish. And they're still working on that 3-month side project.
I'm looking at those pictures, and I think I could find some Worm Online pictures from the early days that match it. But also when I look up Slaves to Armok, it's got, IMDb for some reason has an entry on Dwarf Fortress. Like Dwarf Fortress 2. It looks like the Steam version, but it says Slaves to Armok, God of Blood, Chapter 2, Dwarf Fortress. And I was looking at those pictures going, like, I don't get it. It's full graphics. It's got the dwarves there. It's got trees there. Like, how is this bad? Then I realized it's the updated shots that they're doing for the Steam launch.
Yep. Also, you can still download the original unfinished, barely playable Slaves to Armok, God of Blood at bay12games.com/Armok if you really want to see a website that was made in 2005.
There's a synopsis of Dwarf Fortress. I'm just going to... Wow, okay.
It's too big to get... Of Dwarf Fortress?
In the year 233, Kakame Awerdinaday was the elf king of the dwarves. Wanting to expand his domain, he decided to set forth brave dwarves. And it just goes to all of this, and it's like paragraph.
Someone just ripped Legends mode and was like, this is the story of Dwarf Fortress, the game.
Yeah.
That's funny.
Like, this is literally just how it's...
Man, I need to review. Thank you. You've just given me content. I'm going to make a video reviewing the IMDb page for the story of Dwarf Fortress. Thank you for that. That's my Saturday.
I like how it's not even a synopsis. They're literally writing a story. I mean,
Yeah,
but
and
Urist had been too drunk in the colonist briefing. He didn't know that he had to blah 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 blah. Like, you're actually, this is just a written novel.
They wrote fan fiction.
Yeah.
except there's no like paragraphs. There's no editing.
Huh.
It's a novel formatted like a synopsis. Oh my god! Could you imagine like Dwarf Fortress the disc set, and you put on the back of the box like just a freaking novel of a Legends mode, where it's just like in the year 153, you know, Urist finally joined and settled down at the site of here in the fields of, you know, whatever.
Steven Seagal is Dwarf Fortress.
You joke, but I know I had a viewer pop in who was asking some questions about how to play Dwarf Fortress, and then their questions got kind of telling, and we asked what version they were playing, and they backed out to the main menu, and turns out they were playing on version 3 or 0.3, which was like 2014. And we asked why they were playing on such an old version. And he said, "Oh, that's what was on the disc." And we're
Where
like,
did you find this disc?
"Pardon?" He goes, "Well, you see, I just bought it at a store." And we're like, "Pardon?" Apparently, this person went to a used games store and bought a copy of Dwarf Fortress in a case with a printout of Dwarf Fortress as the case. And it came with a copy of the How to Play Dwarf Fortress book, which it came out in like 2013,
there's
12.
such a thing.
Yeah, it exists. Zach and Tarn helped work on it, but like there's an updated PDF from it, but the book itself hasn't been updated since it was released. There was only one printing of it. It's a softcover book of How to Play Dwarf Fortress. And someone somewhere owns a couple copies of those and is selling them off with boxed copies of an install of Dwarf Fortress.
I still remember I had a friend who was do you ever see that trying to think the most polite way to put it. Do you ever see that episode of How I Met Your Mother where Katy Perry was Sweetie or Sunshine or something? Because she'd come in with the dumbest statement, everyone would be like, "Oh, Sweetie." My friend came in so proud of herself. She had just bought a copy of this this image editing software. Like, she got it on eBay. She only paid $10, super cheap. Pulled out a disc of GIMP, which is a free
software.
to play.
That's
Yep,
funny.
free to
Open source.
free to download. And I was like, "Oh, Sweetie."
It's like buying a copy of Audacity. But yeah, so I don't often get to talk about Dwarf Fortress on this podcast because, frankly, like, I'm the only person in this group of Halcyon Frequency who plays Dwarf Fortress at any regular interval. Bellinair, our teammate from Finland who was on the last 2 episodes, he actually has some credits in Stone Sense. He helped make some of the sprites for it. And has played a lot of Dwarf Fortress, but not in a long time. And I managed to get him to play a couple of forts about 1.5 years ago, but it's been a while again. So for me, I guess the question is, when you go about starting up a fortress, Tekkud, what is your kind of go-to setup? Like how do you go about starting a fortress when you're playing Dwarf Fortress?
Well, if I want to do and this is usually the case, if I want to do a very kind of big idea fort and I want it to have maybe waterfalls inside or a very specific setup in my metal industry or whatever, my first step is actually to make a mini fortress on the surface just out of wood. I build a hut. And I basically create that as a staging point that's going to last me for 1 or 2 years to then carefree mine out and develop this framework for my fortress to be. So I should say there's an important caveat here. There's a reason I didn't make a how to start a fort video on my channel, because I am an obsessive player. I lock on to certain ideas, and I laser focus on them. So when I start my forts, I do that staging fort because it allows me to laser focus on, let's say, the garbage dump of my fort, which can be way out of the league of what you'd expect a garbage dump to be. But so my first, I don't recommend players start fortresses the way that I do, but if you're curious, it's usually by creating a sort of overworld shack that I can operate out of. So usually there's some farms, a small 16 farm tiles, a couple of animals breeding, but I'm not doing anything with them yet. 4 beds, a still, and a couple of tables and chairs. And that's pretty much it. There's a hospital in there too, but there's not much to it. Not until I really get digging.
For me, I spend the first bit in Legends mode and I read about the faction a bunch. And then once I'm actually in Fortress mode, I set the population down so I don't get too many migrants right out of the gate. I usually set it down to about 50 or 60. And then I spend like the first 2 years obsessively reading about every single dwarf in the fort and just kind of like letting them live in kind of the rock pit that ends up inevitably getting dug out somewhere, put up a bunch of beds, make a little dormitory and a makeshift tavern thingy, and just kind of let the dwarves like function for the first 2 years until they eventually live in their lavish wonders. But I kind of wanted to tell a little story about the fortress that I just started this past week because it is one of the strangest factions I've ever encountered. So dwarven factions have varying like types of cultures and music and gods and things that really kind of give you like a pretty vivid image of the culture of this faction that you're playing with. And the faction that I'm currently playing with is the Plank of something. I need to like actually look on my YouTube channel or remind myself of the name of it. But I built this fort and pretty quickly we realized that something was off. My first 7 okay, but before I built the fort in like Legends mode, reading about this faction, all of the entirety of this faction is 2 forts. They have 1 mountain home, which is like their main fort, with a very low population, only 300 dwarves, which is pretty low for a mountain home, and then a helix, which is a hill fort, basically a farming hub that is connected to the mountain home and feeds them with food and whatnot. And that Helix only has 100 dwarves. I'm like, wow, that's awfully small. So maybe we'll be like helping rebuild a faction. The Plank of Nations is the name of the faction. And we get in there and I get my starting 7 and they're all female. I'm like, wow, that's strange. Because normally it's like kind of a mix, right?
Yeah.
Start playing. First migrant wave shows up. Every single one of the migrants is female. This is also strange. Where's my bearded like dwarves? Building away. The third migrant wave shows up, all female except for 4. There was about 10 in the third one, so half of them are male. Okay. All the male are fisher dwarves. I'm like, this is really weird. I look at the faction. The queen of the faction is a Gelder. I start looking
Sounds like
into
you found yourself a cult.
I start looking into their gods. All of the gods are represented by female dwarves. One of them skeletal dwarves. One of them is a skeletal female dwarf. And their gods are all gods of misery and torture, death and destruction. The one male represented god is the god of reproduction and pregnancy.
Pretty sure there's a Nicolas Cage movie about this.
And we're just like sitting there like reading about this faction going like, what in the world? And so I think I've found a cult. Also, the most popular form of music is called future metal, which is pretty fantastic. So I named the tavern the Marsh Pit because Mosh doesn't exist. So we're a bunch of heavy metal Amazons, I guess.
That's
with
hilarious.
A very small portion of the population being male dwarves. And that's the first time I've seen anything like that in Dwarf Fort.
I have a similar female-focused fort. Actually, it's Singe Metal, which I am doing as a bloodline fort with Roland from the Round Table. And I looked up, this is one of the rare times I actually spent a good amount of time looking up the history of my civilization. Usually, I check out what gods they have, and I sort of just kind of infer from there. But in this case, I wanted to know the history of Singe Metal, and every uh, every monarch was a queen, and it was like year 250. It was not. No, it was year like 500. So there's like 6 monarchs, and so it was every queen worshipped the same deity, except for the first, who worshipped the deity of fate, ironically dying like the next year. The last queen got turned into a werewolf and then killed somewhere. And the queen that replaced her worshipped the god that had turned her into a werewolf. So it was like this string of queens that worshipped this god. And then as soon as one of them toppled this other statue, they were like, okay, well, we should worship this other god that turned our past queen into a werewolf, out of vengeance or whatever. And there were some other things about fighting or joining the elves in combat on like a yearly basis to just repeatedly pummel this goblin site called Watchbad. Every year, we and the elves would just go to Watchbad and beat things up. Like, oh, how many goblins came back this year? Let's stab them. And it was like a sport. It was like a combat sport at that point, like kill the goblins at Watchbad. And there was some interesting history there with them too. I haven't gone back to see what's happened in the 10 years or something that the fortress has been alive for since we started it. But it was an interesting little history. And it's only similar in the sense that it was also an all-female monarchy over 500 years.
I have a sort of similar story to the Watchbad thing. I had a world that I generated a while ago, which I did a bunch of different forts in. And one of the things that we discovered in this world, because I sometimes will like just upload the world file to like Google Drive or something and give it to chat and let them go nuts with it. One of my audience members found this one goblin fort that was head up and run by a skunk demon who wielded 2 spears. This one goblin fort got attacked about 250 times a year by all of the surrounding sites. Humans, goblins, dwarves, everybody. Everything attacked this one site. And this one demon in this one fort had tens of thousands of kills.
Wow.
Every single year, all of these armies would converge on this one site, and it was just like this unstoppable wall, to the point where I even joined in with my fortress and attacked it a couple of times, and every time, all of my soldiers would either die or get captured. Every single time. Eventually, one of my audience members sent in an adventurer and killed it. But it's like...
the ultimate defense, apparently, is just skunk odor. As long as you got that on your side, no one can break you.
It's like trying to fight through smoke. You just can't do it. Like smoke wall appears, it's like I can't see where I'm going. Oh, I'm dead.
I had a world I generated the first time I ever really looked into Legends mode, and I discovered that the undead apocalypse, which happens to most worlds as time goes on long enough, isn't always as flat and bland as you might assume. In this case, this world had succumbed to not a civilization, actually. They started as a group that just popped out of nowhere in the fields someday, led by, what was it, a badger man? Some animal person necromancer. And he had obtained the help of a dwarf who had fought in a couple of wars and become quite good as a warrior. And that dwarf died. He resurrected him, and this dwarf became a very talented warrior and undead, and won many fights on behalf of, I remember, Badger Man will say, necromancer. And then at a certain point, this necromancer, thanks to the exploits of this dwarf, who had his own emotional past, basically took over the entire world. This one necromancer faction, and they had killed the goblins. They were wiped out. Everyone was pretty much wiped out. There was like one dwarven civilization with 2 sites still alive. More animals were alive than dwarves in those sites. And it's funny because they weren't even listed on the civilization list. They weren't a civilization. They owned all of the sites, though. They owned the entire world. But they started as this lowly band of bandits, from some fields led by some Badger Man necromancer.
Man, it's like the story of Steve Jobs and Apple.
Right.
Lowly band of bandits,
Yeah.
and now they run the world.
Yep.
I do actually have some sort of news. Every Friday and Monday, Zach and Tarn have been taking turns posting on Bay 12. And for the premium release, Zach posted this today, where he says, let's talk about toggleable difficulty settings. There will be difficulty settings where you can adjust the wealth triggers and frequency of invasions, thieves, and beast attacks, and it will be customizable, just as if you'd been editing the text files, but you can set them when you embark. So we're going to get adjustable difficulty settings for each embark.
Nice.
Which is actually extremely cool, because
Yeah.
I thought that they would be tied to the world, and currently it's tied to your text settings in the INI files in the back end. But being able to set frequency of invasions at the start of an embark is really cool, because you can just be like, I'm in a very violence-heavy zone. Fuck me up, fam. Let's go.
Yeah. And they are world settings right now because they're in the advanced world generation menu. Those things are listed in there. So they are currently set for the whole world. Maybe you can change them after a world's generated through the init files. But right now, you pretty much set it for the whole world. And
Yeah.
I think, in my opinion, well, first of all, that's awesome. That's a solution. I also think that certain things, it might be great if they excluded certain things that you make as a source of wealth that invaders will consider. Because you know how you have created wealth, imported wealth, and then you have a breakdown of what kind of categories are generating your wealth? I think it would be nice if invaders ignored prepared meals, unless they fix the absurd value of prepared meals. Because once you cook 5 pot roasts, the entire world is we need to invade this utopian bastion of wealth and fame because they have 5 pot roasts, okay? And we couldn't even dream of tasting such a miracle.
Yeah,
on
I
our own.
really hope that they fix the value of meals, because it is a little bit ridiculous that a well-cooked steak in Dwarf Fortress is more valuable than an entire house worth of valuables.
Yeah.
There's one other thing that Zach mentions here, which I think is incredible, which is, and if you think that that's a waste of time, you can now buy them off, as they will demand an artifact as a bribe before they attack. Which
That's very interesting.
is something I've been shouting about for a long time.
Yeah.
Because I've always wanted
I
a
love-
giant to show up and demand pants. Because giants don't wear pants. Yes, Arch. You're still on this podcast.
Yeah, no, that's okay. It's okay. It's Dwarf Fortress time.
It's Dorfin time.
I'm just thinking, because I play RimWorld a lot, and it's that'd be nice there too if they turned up and went, "Hey, we're going to attack. Give us this.
Give us your table
Yeah.
with the inscriptions on it, and we'll
You
leave.
see, the thing is you get that happen when you're roaming in RimWorld. You'll actually get a pop-up that says, one tribesman has accosted your 3 guys in the best armor, and he demands this your gems or whatever you've got.
3 space marines
Otherwise
versus
he'll
a dude
fight.
with spear.
Yeah, and it's always really, really off. But it'd be really kind of cool if you had that happen in raids, because it would be do I really want to fight them all? Or can I just be look, I don't
Here,
feel
take
like
Charlie.
dealing with
It's fine. Just we don't
yeah,
like
I
him.
don't feel like dealing with a tribal attack. Go have, all of this extra human leather that I've got sitting down from the last tribal attack.
Well, in RimWorld, they don't give you an option to do any sort of negotiation, but they do have the raiders take a certain amount of stuff and then leave satisfied sometimes. Don't they sometimes take apparently impact wrenches with them and take your doors off and just leave with your doors? They're I like this door, never mind what's behind it. We're out of here.
So they can loot things. I don't think I've ever had them steal a door,
In
but
the
they can
earlier
like loot
versions,
your
they
tables and
used to do
stuff.
stuff like that.
Yeah. So I don't know. I've not the new raid mechanics are so vastly different. They've all got giant breacher weapons now, and they can just destroy any wall you've got. But yeah, they do. If they can't find anyone to fight, they eventually give up and just loot everything and leave.
One other thing that Zach notes at the bottom of this is also the number of trees that it takes to piss off the elves has been greatly reduced.
Really?
Yeah. So previously, it would take like 120 trees or something per year to piss them off, and then they would show up and ask you to not chop down more than 120 trees a year, and then they'd like lower that number slowly. But now it's been greatly reduced. I've always been pro elves because I think that they bring the best trade goods and are boring to fight. But apparently they've all. I'll read this little excerpt from what Zach wrote. And I'm gonna make a video about this later. But the elves are also getting reworked to make them more of a challenge. The number of trees felled that takes to anger them has been greatly reduced, and their attacks are more deadly. These settings can also be changed if you choose, but watch out for when you start in the Savage Lands, as you are in for a surprise along with the rest of the horrible stuff we have planned for the weekend. So apparently they're going to post something over the weekend. So probably by the time this podcast is up, but like
interesting. I hope that if they want trees to piss off the elves, that's fine. You know, the elves can be even more radical in their ideology, but please don't let mushroom trees piss off the elves. Like, why can't I mean, it's fungus, right? They shouldn't care. They shouldn't care about tunnel tube. If I want to give them something in a tunnel tube bin, you know, because otherwise the elves are like they're kind of a barrier. If you're in a place where the elves visit you frequently and they get pissed off that easily, it's like, how do you build beds without going to war with the elves?
So I'd just like to point out the idea of the elves being just blindly looking for a reason to hate you for cutting down any form of tree, even mushroom tree. I mean, it's pretty fitting for an elf, isn't it?
The elves are cannibalistic eco-terrorists. They're basically Dwarf Fortress's PETA. You cut down a tree and they're like, my son! And you're like, the heck is wrong with you there, sir?
But they should, I feel like, because mushroom trees come with their own risks, you know? So I feel like they should be a separate thing with separate risks, and the overland trees. But, you know, this is all stuff I should probably, like, you know, call Tarn on his personal number and rant at him about, because
his email's on the website. You know that, right?
Oh, no, I did not know that, but now that I know.
Bay12games.com/dwarves, and you click contact, and it's Toady1@Bay12games.com.
Listen, Tarn, I'm your greatest influencer. I just want you to know that. I have, like, a lot of subscribers.
Just drink a lot of isopropyl coffee. Call his number and leave a very rambly, drunken message on his voicemail.
Mushroom trees be happy with it. I don't know, man. Just make it do something about it. Darn.
The one thing that I do like to point out is, like, you do know that, like, everything that the elves don't want traded to them, if you have a skilled broker, shows up as red.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Problem is,
it's all obvious. Just don't trade the red stuff.
Usually, my forts will take advantage of metals, and they'll take advantage of rocks to make containers for things. But in example, this current fort, where the only source of metal is sphalerite, which copper makes ugly bins. I mean, I'm sorry. Copper bins are so ugly, I won't make them.
It's bad color.
Yeah. So, and it's at the magma sea. I have to mine between the magma sea to get any metal in my current fort. So I just used wood bins, which sucks. I hate using wood bins, but I did it. So everything is in wood in this fort. So I just can't trade with the elves. They're just like, sorry, guys.
Why don't you make rock pots? And then just put your meals in rock pots and trade them one, like, biscuit, and they'll be happy.
That is a great question. I don't have a satisfying answer for that. I just don't want to.
That's fair. That's what I've been doing in Long Death for decades, because I've got, like, really nothing I can trade to the elves except for, like, swords, and I feel like arming the elves is not a good idea, so I've just been selling them like a pot of food, and I'll give them like an extra pot of food as a bonus, and they're always thrilled. And then they give me unicorns. It's great. And then I cook the unicorns and give them the unicorns in the pots next time.
I feel like a bunch of Dwarf Fortress players sitting around is exactly the same as a bunch of Warhammer players, not Warhammer, or it could be Warhammer, but also D&D players. That is like, oh, my character does this, my party does this, and someone's like, oh yeah, my party did something similar, and then it'll be like, oh yeah, check it. Remember, here's an adventure my party did that was dumb. And it's like, oh, that's hilarious. Here's an adventure my party did that was dumb. And it just goes back and forth. It's not one-upping, but you're basically sharing the dumb stuff that happens with someone else that finally understands how silly or lucky or dumb it is. And
the thing that's sad about people who play Dwarf Fortress is we don't have friends to play games with. Or it's like me, where we opt to not play games with other people. Or it's like, I love that structure, and I love the storytelling that you get out of D&D. I hate the process of playing D&D.
Look, it can be very hit and miss. I am quite blessed that, like, the people I play with, I met online when I was still in Australia. They were the ones that said, hey, you should come to New Zealand so we can play D&D in person. And I was like, I don't know, that sounds expensive. And they went, hey, here's the plane ticket. And I said, okay, I still need to get my passport. So they're like, hey, here's the money for your passport. By the way, what's your blood type? But no, so they're the people that I met online and basically became friends with. They helped me get over to New Zealand, and we now play D&D twice a week, you know? And it's sort of like the success story of finding a group where they suddenly become real good friends that are more than just people you play D&D with. But I've also played D&D with people who, one DM, we worked out that he was just giving us World of Warcraft quests. Like, we literally got into a place and he's like, oh yeah, there's tons of goblins in there. I'll give you each 50 silver for, 5 gold for every goblin ear you bring back. And he's like, I want about 50. And we're just like, okay. And I got a message, is this guy just giving us World of Warcraft quests? Like, it was literally like one of the zones in World of Warcraft. And then we had one that, the group that I joined, before I joined, the space opened up because basically this guy couldn't seduce the evil witch and make her his girlfriend. And so there are negatives. You know, you're never going to find that playing Dwarf Fortress that you're going to have a guy like that. Like, it's really good in social circles having a D&D party that you get on with, but there are very many pitfalls.
Yep.
And I can absolutely understand being, don't want
Dwarf Fortress scratches all of the itches of D&D without actually having to play D&D. But it's also, at the same time, an incredibly obsessive management game, which scratches a lot of other itches that D&D doesn't even come close to.
Yeah, look, you said at the start of this, if we haven't convinced Arch to play, I will be playing when it comes out on Steam, right? I want that graphical thing, you know? And I
want it to look pretty.
I want it to look pretty. I mean, look at the last game I played, my time at Sandrock, you know?
It's terrifying. Mix of ludonarrative dissonance. Sorry, I have to drop ludonarrative dissonance like once every 3 podcasts.
Let me quickly Google that.
It basically means it's a bright, colorful game with a dark, dingy storyline, and one doesn't fit the other.
Oh,
is the short version.
It's funny because it's directly for games, yet that also I love it in music as well. Like, Hey Ya is one of my favorite examples of that. You know, my baby don't mess around because she loves me so, and this I know for sure. But does she really want to, but can't stand the thought of me walking out the door? Like, and it's all this upbeat song. And it's just that,
or
but
like
visuals.
Almost any pop punk song where he's just singing about cutting himself in a really happy, upbeat tune.
Except for Adam's song.
But
Um,
yeah, no, it's Dwarf Fortress is a fantastic game that we could talk about for all day, but we're 2 hours into this recording. We haven't done news yet. So I think we should go to a quick break. When we come back, we'll talk about the news.